Welcome to KennyRoy.com. I'm Kenny Roy. This is the Ask Video Mail for the week of January 24th, 2011. Welcome to the site. Thank you for being here on the site. Thank you for your support and all the new members and all the old members. I hope you're having a great time and I hope all the information is really useful to you. This is a Ask Video Mail, and the way to get your questions into the Ask Video Mail is to send your questions to me. The email address is webmaster@kennyroy.com. I go through every single question that I get. I pick and choose the ones that I think are going to help the most number of members. So please, if you have a question, it's the best way to interact on the site is to get your question answered in an Ask Video Mail. So I'm very excited about how well the site's going and all the questions that I do get. But it's the best way to participate. So if you haven't done it yet, send me an Ask Video Mail question, and chances are you're going to see it in the weeks to come. All right. So without further ado, let's get to the question this week. This week's question is: well, Dean brings up a very good question. Overlap is one of the principles of animation, and it's no doubt one of the first things that you learned when you started animating. And once you get the hang of it, it kind of is a no-brainer, right? You kind of got it, and then it's like, oh my gosh, I get how to do it. It's always going to be, that extremity or that thing that's attached to the main moving object or limb or whatever is always going to kind of lag behind. However, what I like to do to make it even simpler to determine how to approach it, remember, I'm like Mr. Workflow. You got to approach it the same way every single time, or know which way you're going to approach overlap. I like to separate them into mechanical overlap and biological overlap. Biological is when we're dealing with rigs, with a character rig. So your arm, if you're swinging your arm, it's just that wrist is going to bend and it's going to lag behind until you hit that pose. Okay, so we all got that, and it's probably how you learned overlap. It had something to do with that. Animation Mentor students will recognize the pendulum assignment, where you had basically a weight on the end of a pendulum, and the pendulum basically swung around, and you had to animate the weight overlapping realistically. So that assignment, if you did it that way, Animation Mentor students will recognize this. You probably had a little bit of trouble starting out because everything that you're starting to do in the beginning has to do with pose. So let me make it quite simple. With biological overlap, Dean, I like to make sure that I build overlap into my poses all the way in blocking. Reason is because it's giving me something to tweak later. It's not like I have to go back into my blocking plus and my polish and add overlap or like sprinkle in the fundamentals where needed. Instead, I get to basically know that I have overlap in my scene, in this moment, in this motion. And that when I'm refining my animation, I can do just that, refine the amount of overlap. Okay? So with biological, basically anything that has to do with the body and on a bone, I like to build it in as a pose. But for mechanical, I like to do what you suggested, which is kind of the curve offset method. Okay? There are a few exceptions to the rule. One of them is cycles. Cycles, because they're so finicky in terms of having to repeat and look perfect every single time, it makes a lot of sense for something like a long dinosaur tail that's going to be overlapping in a figure eight behind the dinosaur as it walks. It makes a lot of sense to do those poses and then to do the curve offset method with something like that, and just make sure, even if those curves, that little section, let's say it's a 20 frame cycle, even if you end up offsetting those curves so that they're outside frame 1 to 20 on the rest of the body's cycle, if you set your out of range curve types, your infinity curve types, to cycle before and after, then you should be okay. It should work out, because it'll just interpolate those keys that are in the body cycle with that curve type. Okay, so the one exception is things that are very, very, very kind of mechanical in the biology for cycling, like a really fleshy, meaty tail that's overlapping behind the body. If you don't know what the offset method is, allow me to show you. Okay, I just built really quickly this little setup. It's not even rigged. It's just a simple hierarchy, and this is kind of what most people learn overlap on, right? So I'm just going to move it from left to right, or sorry, from right to left, and it's going to just come to a stop, and then we're just going to animate this bottom here. So again, most people, when they started the overlap game, as it moves from right to left, they maybe try to build a pose. Okay, now that's fine and all, but the quickest way to do it is to not think about like what that pose is going to be for mechanical stuff. Again, not with the body. If you're turning your arm, you want to build that overlap into that one strong pose that you're putting into your thing here. I like to go to the frame where the overlap is going to be the strongest, which is basically if this object is not accelerating, but let me make this object accelerate. Basically, if you think about it, if the object is accelerating, then the overlap will never get a chance to catch up. So here we go. So now I've flatted this tangent, and I'm going to bring this one just a little bit further down, so that it really comes to like a dead halt after accelerating into that dead halt. Okay. So here it goes, and then stops. So right at that moment, this is when the overlap is going to be the most. So then I'm just going to go back and forth a little bit less each time, and you actually don't even need to be too worried. So let's make this a little bit longer. You don't even need to be too worried about what size you use, because we're going to do the offset in the graph editor anyway. So this all doesn't really matter all that much. You're just trying to get some values on the keys that you're going to use, and that's kind of it. Okay, so here's our overlap. As I said before, it doesn't really matter, because we can make this just come to kind of a dead halt here. Okay, and maybe this is a little bit too much. Okay, scale that just a little bit more. Okay, so now we've adjusted the values of these keys, and the offset method is an offset of time. So let's just look really quickly what it looks like right now. Okay, a little springy, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of this little demonstration. It won't make it much of a difference. Actually, you know what? I'm a perfectionist. We're all perfectionists, aren't we? Let me just make it just a little bit nicer here. And let's snap these. All right, let's try this instead. Okay, a little bit better. I like it because it's slower, but it can't be too slow. So let's just bring it back just a hair. Okay, cool. All right, so we've got our overlap again. This probably needs to be centered. Just a little bit of cleanup, folks. All right, let's go with this. Whatever this looks like, let's go with it. All right, still a little bit fast. All right, but I'm not going to mess with this too much, because the point is that the time offset is what's going to give you that overlap that is kind of like the successive breaking of joints. So the quickest way is to grab all your joints, or in this case the geometry is just parented, and then just deselect the parent in the chain. Grab these keyframes and then offset them. I'm going to offset them by 2 frames. Deselect that one, offset this by 2 frames, deselect this one, offset this by 2 frames, deselect this one, offset this by 2 frames. Okay. What this is going to do is just going to make this overlap really have a lot of kind of ropey motion in there. Do you see how that when that came to a stop right here, it really has kind of that looseness that we're finally, we're kind of looking for. So that method, I'm not sure how long that took after we had our extremes dialed in, but that method basically gave us pretty decent baseline of overlap. This is about halfway done, I would say, in terms of tweaking the value and the timing and making sure everything looks like you want it to. It also depends greatly on what materials you're trying to assert that this is. Is this a rubber ball on the end of a string? Is this a bowling ball hanging by a chain? Is it a ping pong ball on the end of a rubber band? Those are all very, very, very different objects and materials, and they'll have different weights. But this was basically an instant way to get overlap on something where we can pay attention to pretty much only the graph editor. So that's that mechanical overlap that I'm talking about. Where else is this mechanical? Some places where you might not realize. Like, for instance, it's mechanical when it's secondary motion. Remember the difference between secondary motion and secondary action. If you haven't seen the secondary lecture, it's available in the shop. You should probably check it out, if only for the fact that I give about 100 examples of secondary actions in that lecture. But secondary action is an actual action that is thought through and performed by the character that is not the main action. So it could be, fiddling with your coat as you're turning and walking out the door or something like that. So the turn and the walk out the door is the main action, and you could be even like speaking dialogue on top of that, blah 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 blah, and then that little just adjustment right there is secondary. So secondary motion is when you have basically one thing driving the motion of another. The other thing is the secondary motion. Normally, it's governed by mostly overlap. Okay? So, an antenna is basically an upside down pendulum, isn't it? So you can go straight ahead and animate your antenna. If a character is whipping it, going la 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 la, you can basically just take that antenna and build those extremes and then grab all of the joints in that antenna and just offset them in time, and you'll pretty much in 2 minutes get a very close approximation of what that needs to be, and it will just be tweaking and editing the timing and the size here and there as you're refining that animation. Okay, so it's a really quick time-saving tool, and I'm glad, Dean, you brought it up, how to do that offset method. The last part of Dean's question is it might not be appropriate for the spine. That is true if the spine is doing something that is part of the primary action. Again, if it's in a cycle, you could actually put just the time offset on the spine rotation keys and actually get a pretty good, even final overlap in the spine. It might be okay. So don't just discount this method if you're working with characters and you're moving a character rig. However, the spine, for instance, if a character is landing and landing on the ground and their body is taking the weight and recovering from that, there's going to be a lot of overlap in the spine. So that would be a moment when you do want to make sure that you're working the pose. You're working, you know the principle, which is that, you know, there's going to be that inertia that is going to carry forward that motion that was happening a frame before, and you're going to bend it, but be bending it, paying attention to pose and composition and weight and force in the body more than just hitting an extreme and then offsetting it. So another good question as to if it applies to the spine or not. Depends on what you're doing. Okay. Very, very interesting question. Thank you, Dean, for sending that one in. If you want your questions answered in Ask Videomail, you've got to send them in. That's the only way. Send your questions to webmaster@kennyroy.com, and I look through all of them and I pick out the ones I think are going to help the most people. Who knows, maybe your question will be asked in a video mail in the future. Thank you for everyone for being on the site. Don't forget to refer your friends. You can still get those referral bonuses and earn free time here on kennyroy.com. I appreciate all your support. It's been great, and it's just the beginning. Good luck with your animation. As always, rock on.